Hey Sunningdale! Today we are proud to welcome Julia Barnes.
At only 16 years old, Julia created a documentary called Sea of Life.
Sea of Life is an award-winning documentary that the grades 6 to 8s watched last week. So without further ado, please welcome Julia Barnes.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for having me. So, hi, I'm Julia. I made a little documentary called Sea of Life, and today I'm going to talk to you guys all about the journey that it took to make this movie. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to help me make this an even bigger journey. So I'm going to start off by showing you guys a little trailer for the movie. The moment you enter the water, you become a sea creature. A whole other world opens up in front of you, where you can do anything and fear nothing. This is the biggest, most important ecosystem on the planet, and it's in trouble.
The basic chemistry of our ocean is changing faster than it has ever changed in the history of the planet.
We're seeing very, very major effects on reef systems already.
100 million sharks a year killed by humans.
There will not be any fish by 2048 if we continue to do what we're doing right now. It is ecological insanity.
We're bringing on a mass extinction in the oceans, and that's something that will change everything on our planet.
It's a crime, not just of the century, but a crime of all time.
Without the oceans, we literally will die.
I set out to make a movie because I believed that if people knew what was going on, they'd do something about it.
Big changes do happen all the time, and they don't happen because governments decide the right things. They happen because people create that change.
This is our task, it's not about, are you going to be a doctor or a lawyer or a secretary? It's about, how are you going to change the world?
When everything you love and everything you depend on is in jeopardy, action is no longer an option. It is a necessity.
We will be the ones that will be suffering from what the governments are not doing today. It's not future generations, but it's us right now.
When I was 16, I watched a documentary called Revolution by Rob Stewart. And in this movie, I was learning for the first time that the world's coral reefs, rainforests, and fisheries are expected to be wiped out by the middle of the century. And as a kid who was totally in love with the natural world, I couldn't believe I hadn't known this was happening, and I wanted to do everything I possibly could to turn things around. But I didn't know what I could do that would actually have an impact. So when I got home from the theater, I went on YouTube and looked up every talk and every interview Rob had ever done, trying to find an answer. And I kept hearing the story of how he made Shark Water, which was his first documentary all about shark finning and the fact that shark populations had dropped by 90% because of the demand for shark fin soup. After he came out with that movie, conservation groups started popping up all around the world, and people started fighting for sharks. And after that, shark fin imports to China dropped by 70%. So that kind of proved to me that film could be a really powerful weapon to create change. And about a week after watching Revolution, I bought my first video camera, signed up for a scuba diving course, and decided to make a movie. Now, I didn't know anything about filmmaking at the time, or how much would go into it. But the plan that I had was that I would go down to the Florida Keys, which is the only place in North America with living coral reefs. I thought I would film there for about a week underwater, interview some scientists, bring back all this footage, throw it together, and make a movie that would show people the beauty and importance of the underwater world, and hopefully inspire them to want to fight for its protection. So I went down to Florida with an underwater housing, jumped off the back of a boat, and I was underwater for the very first time in the ocean. You open your eyes underwater and it's a sensory overload. Everything looks, sounds, and feels different underwater. And on my first dive, I met 2 sharks, a sea turtle, and a stingray that was bigger than me. And I thought this was the coolest, most amazing thing. I came up from this dive feeling so happy because it looked like I was well on my way to making this movie and saving the world that I loved. But I went for dinner that night at a restaurant in the Florida Keys, and this restaurant was decorated with all sorts of images from the past, pictures of the Florida Keys of 50 years ago. The moment I laid eyes on one of those photographs, I realized that this beautiful world I thought I had been swimming in was actually a degraded version of its former self. If you look at the types and the size of species that they were taking out of the ocean back then, you realize that the underwater world must have looked radically different. These are sawfish. They're a highly endangered species, and it would be incredibly rare to find one underwater today. But they were taking them out of the ocean in vast numbers back then. The same thing was happening with sharks of all different sorts and varieties, and of course other fish were not exempt from this. These are grouper, and as you can see, they used to be massive. The largest grouper I've ever seen in the Florida Keys was maybe 2 feet long. So the underwater world has changed dramatically in the last 50 years, and the situation with coral reefs is no different. This is a picture that was taken in 1975, and another picture that was taken in exactly the same location in 2014. So you can see the extent to which the reef has degraded. And while it's not all rubble in the Florida Keys, there are still some living coral reefs. There is nothing like that 1975 picture. That just doesn't exist anymore. And this is happening all around the world. So worldwide, 50% of coral reefs have been wiped out, and we're predicted to lose all of them by the middle of the century if current trends continue. So I kind of realized after taking that trip to Florida that finding a healthy coral reef to film was going to be a lot harder than I ever imagined. And this little documentary that I thought I could finish in less than a year ended up taking me 3 years and taking me to 7 different countries all around the world on a kind of quest to figure out how we're going to save coral reefs. So I ended up meeting with a lot of the world's top scientists on corals and learning a lot about them. Corals turn out to be a really amazing organism. And show of hands, how many people think corals are animals? How many people think corals are plants? Almost nobody. Corals are really unique because they're kind of a combination of both. So the coral itself is an animal, but it has tiny plants that live inside their tissues. The plants photosynthesize and create nutrients, which the coral need to survive. And over years of striving for sunlight, corals build skeletons out of calcium carbonate. The skeletons create structures which form the reef, and coral reefs are home to 30% of all life in the ocean, which is pretty remarkable considering they cover less than 1% of the seafloor. So corals are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They can be home to thousands of different species. So corals are really amazing, but they're also in big trouble right now because of something called ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is the biggest issue on the planet right now. Most of the carbon dioxide that we release into the atmosphere doesn't stay in the atmosphere. It gets absorbed into the ocean, making the ocean more acidic. And in a more acidic environment, any animal that builds a shell or a skeleton can't form. So that includes coral reefs. And I'm going to show you guys a little video about ocean acidification.
The chemistry of the ocean is changing 10 times faster than it has at any other time in the past 50 million years. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've released 1 quadrillion pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the ocean has become 30% more acidic.
Now what happens is that as we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, a lot of it is going into the ocean. And when CO2 goes into water, it likes to react with water. And what it does is it creates a dilute acid.
Ocean acidification affects coral reefs and any other animal in the ocean that builds a shell or a skeleton, because in a more acidic environment, shells, skeletons can't form. So that means by 2070, coral reefs literally start dissolving.
Worldwide, 50% of coral reefs are gone. They're predicted to go extinct within our lifetime.
The fundamental importance of coral reefs is that they harbour at some stage in their life cycles, about a third of all the species in the oceans, which makes them absolutely key to the life of the oceans.
Okay, yeah. So ocean acidification is a really big issue for coral reefs, but it's also a lot scarier because it affects anything in the ocean that builds a shell or a skeleton. So that includes fish, and it also includes plankton. Plankton form the base of the entire marine food web. They feed the ocean, but they're also responsible for producing most of the oxygen in the air that we breathe. So 2 out of every 3 breaths we take come from plant life in the ocean. Plankton are enormously important for all life on the planet, and they're in big trouble because of ocean acidification. So I've got another video coming.
Ocean acidification affects everything in the ocean, from plankton up to blue whales, because everything in the ocean is dependent on plankton. All life is dependent on plankton. Plankton just isn't just responsible for, the ocean food web. It's responsible for 2 out of every 3 breaths you take. Plankton is absolutely essential for all life on the planet. And we may be losing it, some say, up to 1% a year because of ocean acidification. And even if it's some small fraction, less than that, it's like, why would we do anything to disrupt the oxygen supply for the planet, for future generations going forward?
So I knew that ocean acidification was this massive issue, and I also knew that it was being caused by our release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I set out to try and figure out how we're going to curb those emissions. And what I learned was that environmental organizations had been working to reduce carbon emissions for decades. So when I found out that these groups were organizing the largest rally for the environment in history, I jumped at the opportunity to join them. I got on a bus with a group called Toronto 350 and went down to New York City for the People's Climate March. Governments were meeting in New York for a pretty massive climate summit, and 400,000 people from across North America gathered in New York City to send a message to those governments that there is enormous public support for reduction in carbon emissions and that we want a living world. Despite this, governments didn't come to an agreement that day. But there was a lot of hope that we were building pressure for the next big environmental conference called COP21, which is coming up in Paris. And in the year leading up to COP21, people rallied in different cities all around the world, putting pressure on these governments. Just to give you a little bit of a backstory on COP conferences, for the previous 20 years, governments had been meeting and meeting and meeting, and failing and failing and failing to come to an agreement. But then COP21 came around, and all of a sudden people started talking, maybe this is going to be the year, governments are finally going to do it and get an agreement to reduce emissions. And they did. After 20 years of negotiations, governments finally came to an agreement to reduce emissions of CO2. People were celebrating this in the streets. They thought it was an enormous success for the environmental movement. But for a lot of us who understood the conditions that are necessary for life to continue in the ocean, we realized that this wasn't really a success at all. The Paris Agreement is a non-legally binding, voluntary agreement among governments of the world to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Coral reefs cannot survive warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the Paris Agreement isn't going to be enough to save the living world. So as I continued ripping around the world, making this documentary, filming with cool species and interviewing scientists, I learned something about ocean acidification that I had never known before. The amazing cinematographer who helped me make this film called me up and he said, there's been an update with ocean acidification. We've learned something new. And that is that there's a lag time between the time it takes the carbon dioxide we put up into the atmosphere to get absorbed into the ocean. So even if we stopped producing carbon dioxide emissions today, a lot of the world's top scientists on corals were predicting that ocean acidification would continue for decades into the future, and that we were going to lose all the world's coral reefs no matter what. So for me, having just spent 1.5 years of my life at that point pouring all my time and energy into making this movie, thinking I was going to save coral reefs, this was about the most devastating thing I could have heard. But it turns out ocean acidification is still something we can turn around. It's just going to take a lot more than stopping emissions. So this is a little video about live time.
Most people don't realise if we switch off all fossil fuels tomorrow, there's so much in the atmosphere, still loaded, that will continue to absorb in the oceans and will still cause the complete collapse of coral reefs.
So even if we stop producing carbon dioxide today, the oceans will have decades where they become more acidic. So part of our task is not just to slow down carbon emissions, but to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We know we've cut down 75% of the forests. If you put all those forests back, that would capture an enormous amount of carbon just in that plant life that we could stave off the worst effects of acidification.
So we know that there's an enormous potential to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Right now, 75% of the forests on land have been cut down. 90% of the fish have been taken out of the ocean. Apparently, if we were to let that life come back, we could sequester more carbon dioxide than what humans have emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So there's an enormous potential to turn things around with carbon sequestration. And we know from places where people have stopped fishing that life can come back to the ocean really quickly. There's a place called Cabo Pulmo in Mexico. It was once a fishing village, but they had so heavily overfished the area that there was almost nothing left in the ocean. So the people decided to create a marine protected area. They banned fishing, and within 10 years of doing so, the biomass, the amount of life in the ocean, increased by 450%. Fish were thriving again in Cabo. And by the time I got there, 20 years after Cabo Pulmo had been declared a marine protected area, the ocean was teeming with life, and it was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to underwater. So we know that life will come back to the ocean if we give it a chance. But right now, industrial fisheries are destroying life in the ocean. So this is a little video about fishing.
There's a recent report that said 86% of the world's fisheries are depleted, and that by 2048, if current trends continue, we will see fishless oceans essentially, which is terrifying. Without the world's fish, we don't have functioning ecosystems. Without a functioning ocean ecosystem, we don't have a functioning atmosphere. And without a functioning atmosphere, we are all literally dead. And without the oceans, we literally will die. This is driven by humans' desire to eat fish.
Every year, scientists estimate between 40 to 54 billion pounds of fish is brought out of the ocean, killed, and thrown back as bycatch because it wasn't our target species. Most fish have air bladders in their bodies, tiny little air-filled sacs which control their buoyancy in the water, like a buoyancy control device, a BCD, in scuba diving. And when you pull a fish from the bottom of the ocean under immense pressure to the surface under almost no pressure, the little air bladders explode and the fish die and they're thrown back into the ocean. And you might think they could survive, but they don't.
All large fish in the ocean have been depleted on average by 90%. Predators who have controlled the oceans for millions of years are being wiped out.
Sharks, for example, have been on the oceans for 400 plus million years, and a lot of life in the oceans has evolved since sharks were there. So they've evolved into a world with sharks. They're shaped by sharks. And if you remove sharks, you kind of turn the food pyramid upside down. You cut off the top and then you allow fish species below them to explode in numbers, and that changes the pyramid.
100 million sharks a year killed by humans. This kind of thing doesn't happen to other animals that we like or enjoy. It happens to sharks because to us they are monsters and not animals to care about.
Humans are a terrestrial species. We don't belong in the oceans. And it's really only in the last 200 years that we've actually existed in the ocean as an alien species. And we're strip mining the oceans. Consuming fish the way that other marine animals do is part of a natural cycle. Again, humans being a terrestrial species, we're literally taking resources out of the ocean and not returning them. There's no way, whether we decrease the amount of fish that we're consuming or come up with new technologies to pull fish out of the ocean, that is going to be beneficial to the world's ecosystems.
So within a span of 50 years, 90% of all large fish in the ocean have been wiped out. Every year, industrial fisheries waste 54 billion pounds of fish as bycatch, fish who are caught, brought out of the ocean, and thrown back because they weren't the target species. And these fish don't survive when they're thrown back into the ocean because they have air bladders in their bodies which explode on the way up. 30% of the fish taken from the ocean every year aren't eaten by humans, they're being fed to livestock. So now pigs, cows, chickens, and house cats are eating more fish than all the world's sharks. The way that we're interacting with the natural world is absolutely insane, and it can't continue. The system that we've built over the last few hundred years isn't working. We've destroyed most of the world we depend on for survival, and we're on track to lose everything by the middle of the century if we continue down this path. By 2048, scientists are predicting a world with no reefs, no rainforests, no fish in the ocean, and 9 billion humans fighting each other over what remains. This does not look good. We can't continue doing what we've been doing. We can't have infinite growth when we live on a finite planet. We can't scoop out the oceans and cut down the forests and expect to be able to survive. So we've got to change everything. And I don't think that change is going to happen because governments decide the right things. I think it's going to happen because a few passionate people decide to dedicate their lives to fighting for the world we depend on. What the ocean needs right now is heroes. And that can be you guys. You can be the heroes in this story. And it has to be you guys because it's your future that's in jeopardy. Everything we love and everything we depend on is in danger of being wiped out within our lifetimes. So I hope you'll join me in the biggest battle ever fought to save life on Earth. The world has never needed you more. Thank you.